amend the Fisheries Act, a terribly flawed piece of legislation which erodes the rights of Canadians. I wish to acknowledge and thank on behalf of all Canadians the research team of the Ontario Landowners Association for the work done by their group on C-68, particularly Elizabeth Marshall and Tom Black. The report they prepared, but were not able to present to the Standing Senate Committee on Fisheries and Oceans, has been highly informative. Canadians will understand, after my remarks are finished, that when you're working with bad legislation, all the tinkering in the world will not fix the wrong assumptions which are at the heart of this bill. The Liberal Party is attempting to violate the Constitution by artificially extending its jurisdiction in contradiction to its constitutional limits. It's also trying to do indirectly what it cannot do directly, which has been struck down in the Canadian courts. The federal government does not have the constitutional jurisdiction to expand environmental protection through the Fisheries Act, as this is in violation of provincial jurisdiction as well as the violation of private rights established under common law, the Constitution Act 1867, and the Letters Patent Crown Grant. Though many laws regulate water and water use, the Fisheries Act remains the only legislation that directly addresses the protection and conservation of fish and fish habitat. Enacted in 1868, the Act is one of Canada's oldest pieces of legislation. In 2012, the Fisheries Act was significantly amended. Quote, amended, though many laws regulate the water use, so I'm going to go now to the Senate testimony. And when we had the OPG, Ontario Power Generation, look at its generation portfolio on hydropower, they determined that they would take an up to 80% increase in instantaneous passage of flow as a principle for meeting the new objectives of the new definition of fish habitat. We would no longer be peaking and holding back water or grid demands outside the greenhouse gas emissions impact, which would bear out. The amendment, so that was very important, but the amendments that the Senate did from protecting fish generally to focus on only prohibiting serious harm to fish that were part of a commercial or Aboriginal fishery. So that's what the 2012 amendments did. And these amendments were common sense in application and were done after listening and acting on the concerns of stakeholders. The 2012 Conservative amendments respected the Canadian Constitution, and it was my pleasure to recommend to the committee reviewing the Conservative amendments a witness to provide practical observations as to why the Fisheries Act needed to be amended. Jack McLaren is a multi-generational orchard farmer from my riding of Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke. Jack had the unfortunate experience of having a ditch hand dug by his grandfather and great-grandfather to collect and direct water to their orchard, declared a navigable waterway after he started to clear a block culvert that was flooding the road to his farmhouse. Needless to say, Jack and many other farmers just like him welcomed the Conservative common sense amendments passed by our government in 2012. The Liberal Party, under the guise of protection of so-called fish habitat, in unlikely places like Jack's Ditch, is actually looking to use the Fisheries Act as an environmental legislation when the federal government has already protections established under the Canada Shipping Act and the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. What really caught my attention on C-68 was the addition in committee of a new concept in Canadian law, the concept of water flow, or as it's referred to in other documents, environmental flow. It was added in subsection 2.2 to amend the Act. Water flow was a hot topic in my riding of Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke. The spring of 2019 now has the dubious distinction of being the worst in recent memory for flooding along the Ottawa River. My constituents are skeptical when the Prime Minister and the member for Ottawa blame every significant weather event on climate change. They do not believe the Liberal Party leader when he claims a new tax on Canadians, the Liberal carbon tax, will stop the Ottawa River from flooding. The residents of the Ottawa Valley have a suspicion that recent flooding has been caused by either government policy or human error, or some combination of both, and they want answers. The question now being asked is, did the federal government cause the flooding? Were the dam operators instructed to hold back water when they should have been releasing water to meet the federal government's new definitions of fish habitat? These are questions my constituents feel can only be answered by an independent inquiry and external review. Expert testimony before the Standing Committee, which I referred to before, certainly seemed to confirm the Government of Canada was planning on making flooding on the Ottawa River an annual occurrence, judging by the question asked by a senator to a representative of Ontario Power Generation who operates the dams on the river. And he said, when OPG looked at our generation portfolio on hydropower, we determined that it would take an 80% instantaneous passage of flow as a principle for meeting the objectives of the new definition of fish habitat. We would no longer be peaking and holding back water or meeting grid demands outside of the greenhouse gas emissions impact, which would bear out. Everyone can remember the spring of 2017 in Ontario and the Ottawa Valley. We had a once-in-a-generation flood event. We had the capacity to hold water on the watershed with our management plans. We've detailed some impacts. One of the outcomes was that the City of Montreal would have been under a meter more of water if we had not had the ability to store water on the watershed because of flooding in the Great Lakes, end quote. Well, the first thing that jumped out at me was the comment that Montreal would have been under an additional meter of water had Bill C-68, as it was voted and passed on in the House of Commons by the Liberal Party, been enacted. The next thing that jumped out while listening to the expert testimony given to that Senate committee was a decision by the Liberal Party to bring forward legislation like Bill C-68 was the limitations that would be placed on one of the cleanest, most renewable, most reliable sources of electricity produces almost no greenhouse gases. Canadian hydroelectricity is the envy of the world. Why would Canadians want to throw away that advantage? To quote a representative from Quebec, who is president of Water Power Canada, an organization that represents more than 60% of all electricity produced in Canada, she stated to the Senate committee, quote, Bill C-68, if passed in its current form, its impact on our industry's ability to operate its current stations and build new ones will be catastrophic, end quote. This now led me to do some research of who was lobbying for Clause 2.2 and C-68, and I then discovered the controversial clause added during committee was proposed by the Green Party. It was then supported by the Liberal majority to be included in the legislation. So why was the Liberal Party on the House of Commons Committee voting in favor of an amendment put forward by the Green Party that would be so disastrous for Canada? Is the Liberal Party really that afraid of losing votes to the Green Party, which shift that far left? I was then introduced to the name of a lobbyist who was on the payroll of the controversial Tides Foundation. These foundations are recognized as threats to Canadian democracy. The Tides Foundation is a foreign-funded organization that's been identified, among other activities, of funding a campaign to block Canadian pipelines. Canadians lost $20 billion last year by being held a captive seller to American big oil interests. Tides Canada American Parent Foundation, Tides Foundation USA, through whom it receives its funding, has been funding dam busting in the western United States. So it's no surprise the U.S. Foundation would fund similar activities in Canada. Registered as a lobbyist for Tides Canada, Tony Ma could count on some powerful friends in the Liberal Party, starting with the now disgraced former Principal Secretary to the Prime Minister, Gerald Butts. Tony Ma worked for Gerald Butts when Butts was at the World Wildlife Fund. With the puppet master on his side, Ma figured he could get anything he wanted. Ma had moved from the World Wildlife Fund to run a project funded by Tides Canada on water. In that capacity, the decision was made to use the Liberal campaign promise to make amendments to the Fisheries Act to move forward with a radical agenda on water by introducing a totally new concept in Canadian law on water flow. This was done by avoiding the Fisheries departmental scrutiny when C-68 was first introduced to the House of Commons and waiting until committee after second reading to inject Clause 2.2 in the bill. By doing this, checks and balances that normally occur by a department before legislation is introduced could be avoided. The concept of water flows or environmental flows comes from the 2007 globalist document, the Brisbane Declaration. And like many globalist documents, the words written do not match with reality. And while it's next to impossible to build any new hydroelectric power dams as identified by the president of Water Power Canada, the declaration envisages the eventual removal of existing dams in favor of floodplain restoration and the return of free-flowing rivers. Okay.
Pursuant to orders, the order made Thursday, June 13th, 2019, it is my duty to interrupt the proceedings and put forthwith every question necessary to dispose of the consideration